Chapter 26. Once we left the jetty, we were driven through the city of Rangoon, which was no longer the thriving capital it had been before the war. There was devastation on every side, which was well documented in an evangelically zealous archive of the Methodist Church describing the situation in Burma immediately after the war. And I quote, "This is an evil age," the Burmese say. First the war, then internal insurrection have succeeded in bringing about almost total destruction to a once orderly and happy land. Over large areas of the country, there is nothing left but deserted villages, looted or burned out. Men, women, and children have lost their lives by the thousands. Important rail and road bridges have been wrecked. On the waterways, Lower Burma's important means of transportation, many of the steam launches and cargo boats were seized or sunk by the rebels after being stripped. Irrigation works at certain places in Upper Burma were destroyed and many government buildings and courthouses burned. Supplies from government depots and rice were burned. It is estimated that the total damage done to the Union through this wanton destruction of public property amounts to $86 million. Reverend Harry Hardwood describes Rangoon under present conditions, and it is here where 3 of our 4 Women's Division missionaries and 4 families of the Division of Foreign Missions are living and working. The city of Rangoon, chief port and trading center of Burma, furnishes striking evidence of conditions over the country. Everywhere are to be seen the still unrepaired ruins of buildings burned, bombed, or looted for their materials as a result of the war. There is much less of every kind of permanent and substantial shelter than before the war, but the inhabitants of the city number around 30% more. They live by tens of thousands in poor huts of inflammable bamboo matting and thatch, on the ruined bases of former buildings, in former open spaces, and in rows along the sides of main thoroughfares of the city. In the early months of 1949, thousands of refugees from the surrounding areas of conflict have flowed in to add to the need and confusion. An unsolved and growing problem before the Christian forces of the land is that of these homeless refugees, the dispossessed and the unemployed. It is not simply that the church stands weak before the needs of outsiders in such plight, but that so many of the needy cases are Christians. 800 of these refugees have been housed in Union Christian High School since the fighting on the outskirts of Rangoon has ceased and there is no longer fear of insurrection within the city. This number has been reduced to 300. Insurgents have been active during the month of September near Kalor, where the Kingswood High School is located. 2 teachers and most of the school servants were taken away to prison. Dr. Stanley Jones dwelt repeatedly upon the theme of the open door when he was in Rangoon on a mission in January, at the time when the Civil War was at its worst. He declared that God does not let doors close before one without opening others. The Christian group in Burma is on a quest to discover, if possible, what open-door opportunities the present situation has to offer. Christian opportunities, Christian schools offer an opportunity for useful Christian service. Since the war, the national system of education has been badly crippled. Public revenues have been too limited to support it. The loss of several years of schooling for the majority of the children of the country has not been made up. Mission schools with rehabilitation funds from overseas have been more completely restored than those depending on resources within Burma and are best equipped both in staff and materials to give adequate educational opportunities to the children of this generation. The Chinese Christian High School, a post-war development of our pre-war separate boys and girls schools, has an enrollment of about 1,000 students. Its Christian influence reaches far out into the large Chinese community in Rangoon. Church services are held in the basement hall. A floor in a nearby dwelling has been rented and made into a community center for women and children. There are books, tables, and chairs play equipment, a sewing machine, a piano for those who come for recreation, work, or fellowship. Miss Hazel Winslow is present every day to direct the activities of this miniature institutional church in its 7-day-a-week program. In addition, she teaches religious education to the pupils of the higher classes of the school. Her efforts supplement those of the pastor and his wife as they work among the Chinese people of Rangoon. 700 boys and girls representing 10 races and 5 or 6 religious faiths make up the student body of the Union Christian High School. 62% are Buddhist and 34% Christian. Under Christian teachers, this predominance of non-Christian students presents an evangelistic opportunity. Buddhists are not easily won to discipleship for Christ, but children from Buddhist homes in this school will most surely imbibe some of his teachings and acquire something of Christian character. Last year, 22 young students, all from Christian or part Christian homes, made their decisions for Christ and were taken into church membership. Even mute buildings wield an influence. Amid all the destruction and ruins in Rangoon, the rebuilding of the English school has heartened and encouraged thousands. Its great assembly hall, where all important city functions have been held, is no longer shattered, but has become a place of beauty and wholeness. All except one wing of this magnificent building has been rehabilitated so that busy, happy children fill its rooms all day long. The top floor is occupied by staff members and a missionary family. It is regrettable that Judson College has not been allowed by educational authorities to be reopened since the war. Its beautiful buildings have been taken over by the University of Rangoon, except for the cathedral-like chapel, which serves a place of worship for the Christian students in the university. In all of Burma, there is no college under Christian management. End of quote. After spending a few days in Rangoon, we took the train to Tazi, the closest station to Kalor that still had a functioning railway line. At Tazi, an open truck was loaded with all our belongings, and we perched ourselves on top of the metal trunks and bedrolls, too excited to feel any discomfort for the rest of the journey. The truck rolled along the road, past flat stretches of paddy fields, and then gradually climbed up into the Shan Plateau, rumbling along hairpin bends through forests of pine, cassia, coral, teak, and pinkado trees, and over the roads that were still being repaired. Occasionally we saw solitary Japanese prisoners of war with shovels who stopped working and looked up as we went past. The expression on their faces is etched indelibly on my mind, and I sense that they must have been longing for home and were yet wary of the disgrace for the defeated that would greet them on their return. The Japanese military policy of never surrendering made the very fact that they had survived questionable, and many committed suicide rather than live on in shame. Those prisoners of war who later returned to Japan did in reality face punishment, ostracism, and starvation. The truck drew closer to Kalor, and we were breathless with anticipation. The scent of pine and flowers grew stronger, and we knew we were nearly home when we turned a corner and followed the road down a small slope. And then we saw the house, sitting almost square in the middle of the lot. The long, bumpy ride failed to render us stiff or slow, and we leapt off the truck, opened and entered through the whitewashed wooden gate, and ran into the garden. Chapter 27. The house remained standing, but the garage and the servants' quarters were gone. So had all the neighboring homes. The space between our house and the Persian Shirazi family home, a block away, was cleared of any buildings, and we could see their house quite clearly from ours. Later, we would occasionally see one of the ladies praying or walking past one of their windows, which, like ours, now had no curtains. My younger siblings and I didn't notice anything different, because we had no memory of Kalor as it was before the war. But my older brothers and sisters and my mother were looking at it again for the first time after the war, and they remembered it as it had been on the day they left. Tears welled up in their eyes from conflicting emotions, tears of joy at returning home, and tears at the drastic change that had taken place. A few days later, with faint hope of finding anything, the area where our things had been buried was carefully dug up. We didn't expect to find anything because, to start with, the concrete layer that had covered the items was gone. As expected, there was nothing left. News of our arrival spread rapidly through the town, and soon friends and relatives arrived to meet us. They told us of the many who had fled and died on their trek out of Burma, and how those who had stayed and bemoaned the fact that they could not escape had ironically survived. The adults hugged each other, some struggling to hold their emotions in check, and then simply breaking down into sobs. Others smiled with joy at seeing each other again, but also displayed sadness at the ordeals that we had all had to endure and at the change that had taken place in all of our situations. What we learned from them was that while we were attempting to settle down in India, a very different kind of adaptation was taking place for the people of Kalor. The War Years in Rangoon and Kalor. Chapter 28. It began when the rhythm of marching feet grew steadily louder as the Japanese army descended upon the town, boots tramping in unison. Surreptitiously peeping from behind closed windows, the townsfolk who had remained watched in fear, not knowing what to expect, but the Japanese entry into Kalor was without incident. They met no opposition from the British forces, as the few that had been stationed there had exited some time before their arrival. The local people, with trepidation at first, and then with a semblance of composure, accepted and adapted to the situation. With the rapid exit and defeat of the British from Burma, the bombing ceased, and life settled down to a new set of rules and regulations imposed by a different colonizer. Japanese currency replaced the Indian rupee, which was then the legal currency of Burma and had such low value that people had to lug around huge bags of money to purchase the simplest of their needs. English was replaced by Japanese as the medium of teaching. Morning assembly in schools commenced with the Japanese national anthem, Kimigayo, which children had to memorize. Songs like Mashiro Kifu Koji no and Oshi Nana Yoru were incorporated into the music repertoire of many folks, and children who have a special ability to adapt and adopt new cultures became fluent in the language. In Rangoon, prisoners of war and other suspects were tortured on the streets and in full view of the public as a deterrent by the Japanese army. Young children witnessed hands being immersed in boiling water before fingernails were torn out. Ponjis were often targeted and were considered lazy beggars, and as a lesson, a lit candle was placed on their bare backs, which they were forced to balance while the hot wax melted and the candle burnt all the way down. On one occasion, Shakila, a young girl who later became a close friend and who had stayed behind with her family, was playing in front of the house with her friends, ranging in age from between 5 and 10 years, when a group of Japanese soldiers started walking past. One of the children threw a stone toward them, in that senseless way that children can behave sometimes. Face flushed with anger, the soldiers turned upon the children, striking at them with the butts of their guns and making slashing gestures at them with their bayonets. Today, Shakila still has the scar, remnant of the long, deep gash she sustained across her knee, slashed by the point of a bayonet, which, according to her, left her weak from loss of blood. The children seemed to be particular targets of the Japanese brutality in that they were beaten for any perceived misdemeanor. They were thought of as spoiled and undisciplined, and the parents were considered ignorant in the correct methods of child rearing. Another incident occurred when some soldiers roasted a cobra over an open fire. As the children unwittingly walked by, They were, to their horror, commanded to come and share the meal. Those who could ran as fast as their little legs could carry them, while the soldiers laughed disparagingly behind them. There were rumors about Japanese women embarrassing the local tailor by stripping naked so that he could more accurately take her measurements. I later discovered that this could very easily be true because the Japanese attitude toward nudity was and remains very different from that of the Burmese, especially in those days when Burmese women were expected to clothe themselves modestly, while the Japanese practiced an unabashed communal bathing with all clothing discarded. Ever since the Japanese soldiers had marched into Kalor, the children in the Shirazi household sensed a certain tension in the adults. The home of this Persian family was just a block away from ours, and the patriarch of the family had arrived in Kalor even before my father had, having, like him, heard about opportunities to do business in this new territory. As a young man of 19 living in Shiraz, he was tempted to start out on his own, and being adventurous, he decided to try his luck in Burma, thinking that he could easily return to Shiraz should things not work out for him. He boarded a boat from Bombay to Rangoon and rode on horseback to Tazi and then on to Kalor. He set up a small shop selling a few items, and his business thrived so well that he soon married a girl from Shiraz. They had 2 sons, Hassan and Aga, who each married one of 2 sisters also from their city in Iran. By the time the Japanese invaded Burma, the Shirazi clan had grown considerably with many daughters and a few sons. The hard work of the Shirazis had paid off handsomely, and they became relatively wealthy. But now they were filled with trepidation at the impending war. As was the case with all those who feared the invasion of the Japanese, the Shirazis decided that it would be in their best interests to leave Burma as soon as possible. But the grandfather had put too much effort into what he now owned to risk losing it, and he was adamant in his decision to stay. The sons could not envisage leaving their father behind, so they and their respective families stayed on in Kalor. Chapter 29. Once the Japanese arrived in Kalor, the Shirazis found themselves in a state of constant watchfulness, as if waiting for something to happen. And as is the case when one is in a state of expectant anxiety, they snap to attention at any unexpected sound. One evening, as the day came to a close and darkness fell, weary with the apprehension that had become a constant in their lives, the family settled down to sleep. Lying on their beds, enclosed within their mosquito nets, they felt a semblance of serenity, while the soft pillows under their heads triggered the dream state. The faint light of the stars failed to break the deep blackness of the moonless night, when, as if in response to their waiting, boots were heard stomping heavily down the street. The sound stopped as the soldiers paused to look up at the windows, and then, with thudding hearts, the family heard the creak of the gate as if it were being opened, then a light click as it seemed to swing back into position and close. They heard the crunch of gravel on the driveway, and then loud, bold knocking on the door. With a sudden surge of energy, they moved from a state of slumber to alertness, and briskly put into place a procedure that had already been planned several days earlier. The frightened women who were on the upper floor of the house were quickly hustled out of the back door, which on that level was directly connected to the store behind it. The store itself facing the main street on the other side. Mr. Shirazi then opened the front door and found a small group of Japanese soldiers standing stiffly before him. They demanded to know if there were any ladies present in the house, and when he denied the presence of any women in the house at the moment, they brushed him aside and marched into the living room. They then began a thorough search of the house, looking around the kitchen, opening cupboards, checking under the tables, and looking behind doors. Then, thumping up the stairs, they checked the bathrooms and the bedrooms, drawing the mosquito nets back and peering into each bed. Finally satisfied that there were no women there, they left. This was a rather unusual occurrence because it was not reported by any of the people in the town as a role often played by the Japanese army. It was later discovered that certain members of the community who had some enmity toward the family told the Japanese that if they needed comfort women, they could be found at this house. In actuality, the Japanese had their own comfort women who were stationed in a building by the large banyan tree near the marketplace. The next morning, the soldiers returned and arrested Mr. Shirazi, having heard again, probably from the same source, that he had leanings toward the British. He was immediately taken and locked up in jail. He remained there for several days until other members of the town who had a good rapport with the Japanese, advocated on his behalf, stating that he was a respectable man in the community and had no connections with the enemy. He was released, but it was only a short reprieve, for before the month was over, loud knocking on the door was again answered by Mr. Shirazi. This time he found himself confronted by 4 soldiers who wore grim expressions, severe enough to send a shiver of fear down his spine. The short, stocky one, who seemed to be in charge, stated in sharp, clipped tones that the entire family would be given 1 hour in which to pack and that they were all to be moved to a different location. Mr. Shirazi made an effort to protest the gross injustice, but was immediately silenced by the threatening manner in which the soldiers held their rifles. The sky had been overcast all day, and now at dusk, just as they started walking out of the house toward the army truck that stood waiting to transport them, tiny water droplets started splattering down. They had no idea where they were going to be taken as they huddled together under the tarp canopy, with the few possessions that they were able to collect at such short notice. Running through their minds were the atrocities unleashed on others that they had heard of, including cannibalism, experiments in the name of medical research, and large-scale massacres and torture. The truck jerked forward, turned right toward the marketplace, and then, turning left, moved into lower gear, revved its engine as it went up the slight incline, and then swerved right again onto the road that went out of the town. By now it was completely dark, and the rain drummed down on the taut fabric above their heads and blew in from the open sides and back end of the truck. The jungle on either side of the road, invisible in the darkness, made its presence felt as the headlights of the truck picked out the white furlong markers through the silver of streaking raindrops. Nargis Shirazi, about 12 years old at the time, peered into the darkness, counting them. She had counted 7 markers when she saw the huge chindes, the lion sculptures of Sher Basti, loom out of the night on her left. Then the truck turned off the paved road and pulled onto what appeared to be a gravel driveway where it stopped. They were escorted toward a building that looked like an army barracks. This was the area that the Turkish prisoners of war had been housed after the First World War, and this became the residence of the Shirazis, where they were interned for a year. Here they put up with the discomfort without complaining, simply grateful that they were still alive. Initially, they were provided with cooked food, Japanese cuisine, to which they were quite unaccustomed, and thus quite unpalatable to them. So they pleaded that they be given uncooked food that they could cook themselves, and the Japanese complied. The reason for their internment was never explained to them, and neither was the reason for permission to return to their home again a year later. Arriving back at their house, they discovered to their dismay, but not unexpectedly, that everything had been looted. They felt the loss most of all of the beautiful Persian carpets which had covered all the floors of the home, and which they had brought all the way from distant Shiraz. Chapter 30. On August 1st, 1943, the Japanese declared Burma's independence and instituted Aung San as war minister. However, it soon became evident to him that it was a hollow victory, and on the anniversary of the following year, he boldly declared the independence to be fake. He had by then already secretly turned the forces of the Burmese National Army against the Japanese, and had by 1944 aligned with the British and Allied forces. This spelled the demise of the Japanese conquest of Burma, and by early 1945 they were beating a hasty retreat. Later, as the British returned in strength, the Japanese, in a surge of paranoia, turned their gaze upon the Ponjis with suspicion. In Calore, one Ponji became the focus of their attention. He was arrested and brought to the garden tap at the end of our house, and was placed in an awkward position on a plank under the tap. His lungs and chest were at an angle higher than his head, which was tilted back. The tap was then fully opened so that water gushed into his upturned mouth. It became impossible for him to exhale more air, and he couldn't cough out more water. His lungs collapsed, and his sinuses and trachea became filled with water. Just as it appeared he would drown from the inside, the tap was turned off, and he was given a little time to recover, after which the procedure was repeated. After the second episode, the Japanese soldiers found it difficult to revive him, and when he finally came to, he began to blabber incoherently, and from what he seemed to be saying, he had committed every imaginable crime. They let him go then, and they say that he never recovered from that episode, and spent the rest of his days in a monastery muttering to himself. Between 1946 and 1948, on the basis of the July 7, 1929 Geneva Convention, 25 Japanese leaders were convicted by the International Military Tribunal of the Far East for war crimes, specifically for water treatment or waterboarding, as it is more generally known today. Ironically, there are governments today in so-called civilized societies that exercise waterboarding as a legitimate form of interrogation and are not brought to justice for the inhumane treatment of their prisoners. China, which was the main ally of the British and the Americans and had been involved in extended wars with Japan over territories the latter had occupied, not surprisingly, found its soldiers the target of gross brutality. For instance, a young Chinese soldier, not more than 16 years of age, who was captured by the Japanese while hiding in the jungle behind my uncle's house, was dragged out, stood against a tree, and pinned to the trunk with a bayonet. It was always made certain that the brutality imposed upon suspects was witnessed by as many people as possible, so that it would act as a deterrent. But as is often the case, that element in human nature for compassion and justice, which cannot be suppressed, turned the tip of weaponry against the oppressors. Buddhist sensibilities were aroused against the cruelty, and the nation's populace gave full support to the Burmese leadership, which had swung over to the Allied forces.